Hey, what's up guys? My name is the Cherno. Welcome back to another one of these Hazel development logs. Today we're going to be talking about what has happened in the last 2 weeks with Hazel. As most of you probably know, the way that I like to create these videos is to divide them into two parts, really. There's this kind of beginning part of me talking to the camera, and this is a lot more focused on my life in the last 2 weeks rather than Hazel specifically, although I do tend to talk about programming and game engine development related topics as well. And then there's the second half of the video that is just me showing what is new in Hazel-dev. Now, if I do say so myself, I think that the best way to enjoy these videos is to watch the whole video. But for those of you who are only interested in either this part or the Hazel-dev part, I've added timestamps in the description of this video, and they should show up in the actual video timeline. So if you want to jump to the Hazel-dev part, then you can do that because I care about you. For those of you who live in Australia, I think you probably know that the situation with the virus is more or less getting a little bit out of hand, particularly in Victoria, which is the state that I live in. And because of that, we've basically gone onto lockdown again. So because of that, I think that I have been feeling kind of a little bit down lately. Probably haven't done as much work as I wanted to just because of the fact that it brings you down. I'm really grateful that my family and I were able to go on a little 3-day holiday to the mountains and see some snow here in Australia this winter snow season before the lockdowns actually commenced. So super happy that I got that little holiday in, because if I didn't, well, but anyway, that little holiday meant that I had less time during these 2 weeks to work on Hazel, which I'm totally happy with. The biggest thing that I've been focusing on for Hazel, as most of you know, has been the whole 2D workflow thing. So I want to be able to create a game from scratch using just Hazel. All of that workflow should be present in the editor, in the actual engine runtime, everywhere. And a big part of creating games is actually filling them with some sort of content. Just having a scripting language is fine, and there's a lot that you can accomplish with that. But ultimately, the way that you add contents to a game using, an engine such as Unity or Unreal is typically by just adding components to entities. So if there are various different component types, they have certain behaviors or some kind of work attached to them. And by adding new component types, that's essentially how you add content to a game engine. The thing is, once you have an entity component system and a scene system and all of that is kind of running as it is now with Hazel, every little thing that the engine is going to support could theoretically be added as a component to an entity. Now, whether or not you want to absolutely add everything that your engine actually supports as a component is debatable. I probably wouldn't do that. Some things should be intrinsic to the actual core of the engine itself and probably should not be present as components in the entity component system. But again, that's a topic, that's a big topic. So because of that, I do want to actually add everything I need to be able to make a game using Hazel. Now, I've done this before. I've made a game in about an hour using Hazel. I'll have it linked up there for those of you who have not seen it, basically like a little Flappy Bird clone. I made that entirely using code because that's all that Hazel had back then. I want to repeat that experiment very soon, maybe in the next couple months or so. I want to repeat that experiment, make the exact same game again, however now using Hazel-dev and all of the features that are built in once I deem it ready enough. So in other words, I want to make that game from scratch using Hazel-dev. I should probably be able to make the whole thing in an hour instead of making the base game in an hour and then spending another hour hacking in various effects and particle systems and stuff like that. I think it'll be a really cool way to see how far Hazel has actually come. Now, in that video, I did use the public version of Hazel, whereas for this, I'd probably use the development version of Hazel. However, I think that it's still gonna be a really good test. And so because of that, I've basically been using that style of game as a little bit of a guide to determine what features I want to add and in what order, because ultimately speaking, a game engine is very open-ended. There are a list of probably a huge list of core components that you want to have regardless of what you're trying to make, and things that I guess users of game engines would expect to be present in a new engine that they pick up and start using. However, instead of just going through that list and everything being really boring, I've kind of had this game in mind as my goal. And that's why it's really important, I think, to set goals that aren't simply lists of work that you have to do, but rather a concrete kind of goal that results in an end product that you are able to create in a fairly manageable, a small amount of time, not something that's gonna take you a year, but something that maybe you can accomplish in the next few months. And that way you can actually well, in my case, build that game, and then you'll have that game that you built using your technology. You had to add everything along the way to make that happen. And there you go, it's possible now. And I think that that's a really good way of working at it. So with that goal in mind, I had to look at that game and I had to think about what things are required for Hazel to make that happen. Now, the first most obvious thing, apart from like the sprite rendering, which already exists to some degree anyway, is the physics. So that's a 2D game. There needs to be some kind of 2D physics system, not just for actual rigid body physics and like things bouncing around and hitting each other and stuff like that, but actually just plain old collision detection as well. So being able to see if this square intersects this other square, or if this triangle intersects this polygon, or something like that. That kind of collision system is something that one of the first things that I think of when I think of what's required to build a 2D game. Because even if you don't have actual like, you know, bouncy physics of things bouncing against walls and more or less realistic, in a more or less realistic way, you still need to be able to detect, hey, is my character walking through a wall or not? And because of that, we need to have some kind of physics system. So that's what I decided to do over the last few weeks. I added Box 2D as a physics system into Hazel. So now we basically, I forked it and did my usual thing of adding a pre-make file to it and then adding that into Hazel-dev. Hazel-dev now has that, and I've added two components, two very simple components, a rigid body 2D and a box collider component, box collider 2D component probably. I don't even remember what it's called. But basically, those two components together are how you can add physics to basically anything. And what happens is physics is entirely a runtime system. So you can set up your physics and your rigid bodies and all of that stuff, obviously, while you're in the editor. But before you hit play, nothing's going to be simulated. Now, I know that some engines have like a simulate button, and that is quite useful, I think. So in other words, that will just more or less play your scene, but leave you in the editor view. So that's good for like, you know, checking, hey, is this material bouncy enough when you're working with physics materials? Stuff that we don't really have yet. But ultimately for now, I've just said, no, I'm not gonna do that. That's gonna be too much work to implement everything now. Let's start with the basics. And so what I've got is when you hit play, the physics will play, because at that point they will actually be added to a Box 2D world and simulated properly. So that's what happens. And then of course there are certain like parameters with the world itself that you want to set up, such as like the gravity, what that's set to, which I haven't really exposed into IMGUI controls yet, but that's going to be part of the scene. So with that in mind, we have physics, and that's what I'm about to show you when we switch over to looking at Hazel-dev itself. But ultimately, with that system in place, the biggest thing I think that's remaining, apart from just fleshing it out, so again, we just have box colliders now. We obviously want to be able to have like circle colliders, polygons, various polygons, stuff like that, triangles. That stuff is also very important because we have more than just square shapes usually. But also, the biggest thing that I see at the moment is the whole collision callback system. So in other words, I want to know if an entity collides with another entity, and I want to be able to handle that in my C# script. Speaking of C# scripts, one of the things that I have exposed actually is impulses. So in other words, you can add like a force or an impulse to a body using C#, and I'll show you that in a minute as well. So that's pretty cool because apart from just simulating like a world of physics, I was also able to make the WASD keys actually move the entity via impulses. So that's pretty cool, I think, as well. The last thing that I wanted to mention was 2D physics don't necessarily have to be used with 2D rendering. There's nothing about 2D physics that links it to 2D rendering. You can still use 3D rendering and render everything as 3D, but simulate your physics in a 2D space. There's nothing to stop you from doing that, and that's what my demo does as well, because we do have 3D rendering in Hazel. So all I do is I have added, I've got some meshes, I've got my 3D meshes and entities with those mesh components. I've added a rigid body component to it, and now it's obviously constrained to 2 axes of movement. It's constrained to X and Y. You can't move it in terms of like the Z axis or anything like that, because Box 2D, of course, only simulates 2 dimensions of physics. So you can't really use it in that sense, but you can still move the camera 3-dimensionally. Everything is still rendering 3-dimensionally. It's still using physically based rendering, so you get all of the benefits that you can have from that. It's just that when entities move, they move into 2 directions or 2 dimensions, right? So that's another thing that's worth noting. Just because I haven't added 3D physics to Hazel doesn't mean that you can't make 3D games using those physics. You absolutely can, and that's what I've done in my demo. Anyway, before we jump into Hazel-dev and see all this in action, I want to give a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters who make all of this Hazel development possible. If it wasn't for you guys, I would not be working on Hazel more or less full time, and I wouldn't be making videos talking about it and teaching like how to make game engines and doing all of this stuff. So thank you everyone for your support. Patreon.com/thecherno is the best way to help support everything that I'm doing here. And if you do help support everything that I'm doing here, you'll also get access to all of this Hazel development code, as well as weekly live streams where I work on this stuff. So if you're interested in trying this stuff out for yourself as you see it in this video today, then definitely jump on board on Patreon. And apart from getting access to all this fun stuff, you'll know that you are making it possible for me to actually develop and add new features to all of this stuff. So anyway, let's dive in and take a look. Okay, so here we are in Hazel-dev. I've decided to be a little bit more chill with the way that I actually talk about this stuff, rather than trying to define some kind of like script essentially of what I'll be showing in this video up front and then like making sure everything works. I'm just gonna go with it because I think Hazel's getting to the point where, first of all, I might come up with stuff to talk about on the fly, but also I want to show this actual engine in action and not just like some kind of code path that I know is stable and works. So in other words, if this crashes, then I'm sorry, but you'll know that it's real. All right, so if I, one small thing that I added, there are some changes that I'll go through here, but essentially the current scene is now written up here, as well as hazelnut, and also what kind of build we're running. So in other words, this is a Windows x64 build, and this is a release build. So if we go file open scene, I've made a scene here called physics 2D test, which is my kind of test of the 2D physics that I've added. This is what it looks like here. The other thing that I've added is this kind of script menu here, which has reload C# assembly and also reload assembly on play. So if you click on this, it becomes checked. What this now will do is every time I hit play, it's actually going to reload the assembly here. So I have a few different scripts that I've played with, and we'll see that in a minute. But we basically have this player cube script. You can see that if you look at this, you'll see the API and how everything works. We have this horizontal force and vertical force floats being exposed. We have the rigid body 2D component, which we're acquiring in the onCreate function by just doing this. The mesh component, this was a way for us to I was playing around with the different materials, and this is just a way to set the metalness of the player cube specifically to 0. Because I think what I had at some point was this random color script, which basically will just select a random color. And yeah, I mean, this API is a little bit clunky at the moment. We have to get material number 0. We have to set this string, because that's the name of the uniform that we're using in GLSL, to a certain value. Obviously, it's very dodgy, but this is still kind of early days. Back in player cube though, where everything fun happens, in the onUpdate function, you can see that I'm able to apply a linear impulse based on the horizontal force to an offset of like 0, so it'll occur in the middle of the actual entity in this case. And false, I think, is for wake, and that's just, these are mostly box 2D kind of arguments here. The A key will move it left, presumably, and then the space key I'm able to add vertical force. So it's almost like we're simulating a jump. Not really. I mean, it's just going to move it up if we keep it pressed. What is this code? Oh yeah, okay. And this code, by the way, I wrote about a week ago almost, so that's why I'm kind of looking at it for the first time in a while. But I did say this would be more chill, so here you go. The color here is, if you press the Q key, it just changes the color to be red. And you can see over here, I think it just sets it to whatever the color is. So this is a nice little way for us to, and I can move this up. This is a nice little way for us to just basically test to see if we can press the Q key and change the color to red. This was initially going to be me actually, once I added the collision callbacks, all of the collision events. And if I handle them here, I was just going to make the actual cube go red if it hits something, but I haven't done the callbacks yet. So at the moment we can just press the Q key to see that happen. But this is still just more or less a test of the actual API. So if we go back to our editor, you can see there's a whole bunch of boxes here. I think I showed this last time, but you can also click on it, and then if you press Control D, it will actually make a copy of it, which you can then move somewhere. So that will duplicate the entity. So I've done that a lot, and that way I've created all these boxes. It wasn't by me manually creating all of them. That would have taken forever. But if I click on one of these, you'll see a few things. First of all, this is pink. We've got this like pink square here. So what is this? This is the current way of looking at the actual size of the box collider. So you can see over here in the properties, we have a box collider 2D. It's got an offset of 0, 0 and a size. And the size is very specific size here, but really all it is it's half the scale. Because this cube is 1 meter squared, or rather 1 meter cubed, but the physics, I guess, is 1 meter squared. And so what because we know that that's the case, if I just set a scale of 4.48, then, and Box2D deals with half extents, then half of that is going to be exactly right. You can see if I change this, I can actually change the size of this collider. So that's what's happening there. At the moment, we're displaying the collider as a pink square because I don't think we can render rectangles in Hazel at the moment. So in other words, they have to be filled, and that's why you're looking at this. So this was just obviously me being a little bit lazy and not implementing drawing rectangles because I was trying to work on physics. So there we have that. Yeah, so selecting all of these, what I've done is I've manually just, made the collider the right size. At the moment, if I was to like create an empty entity over here and then add like, we'll just add a box collider to it, I guess. You can see that the box collider is just going to be initialized with a size of 1 by 1, and then it's really going to take me actually trying to resize it and do all of that stuff to actually get it to be the right size according to the mesh. So there's no kind of automatic sizing at the moment. It'll just be 1 by 1, and then you can resize it to what you want. So that's what I've done with this plane here. Again, this is a 3D plane in 3D space, but physics is in 2D. So what we do is we pretend it's 2D basically, and we just make it take up the whole space, which is what it's doing here. Again, you can see the size is 25. That's half of the X scale. And then for Y as well, it's half of the Y scale. Now, this is a static rigid body 2D, whereas these are all dynamic. And that, of course, means that they will move around. The physics system will kind of move them and they'll respond to physics. Whereas static means that the physics system does not kind of control it. It's something that we can essentially collide with. So that's what we have here. Okay, cool. What else? Oh, and obviously the player, which is this one here. The player has the player cube script module attached to it and a horizontal and vertical force that we can set up here. It's also a dynamic rigid body 2D with like a collider and everything set up. So if we hit play now, you can see that this will simulate our 2D physics, which is really cool. Now, one of these is the player, and if I hold Q, as you saw with the script, I'll actually see it. So it's this one here. If I try and move this with the WASD keys, not actually working at the moment. So this is what I mean. I'm not sure why that happened. Maybe because I think it worked because I think it didn't work because there wasn't enough force coming out, and there were obviously entities on top of it. So you can see we can move it with the WASD keys, we can crash it into things, and it works pretty nicely. Now I think the material is quite full of friction here, which is probably why it sometimes picks up these cubes, but also, even though these cubes look tiny to us, they're 1 by 1 meter. So that's why the physics can look a little bit clunky here. Oh, okay, it fell asleep. That's probably what happened, because now I can't actually, okay, well, let's do this as an experiment. I promise I have not tested this, so I have no idea if it's gonna work, but I'll actually change the wake to true in all of this for all of the WASD keys and sorry, the DA and space key. So if I rebuild this by just hitting Control-Shift-B and hit play again, it should actually just work because we had the reload assembly on play checked. So this is the player. So let's kind of make it settle so that it like falls asleep. And then now if I wait a bit and I move it, there you go. So I think that that's working now. So that's pretty cool. That's a nice way to demo the script reloading actually working, even though I promise you that wasn't scripted, no pun intended. And I had no idea that would happen. But yeah, there you go. And if we wanted to change it from red to like green or blue or something like that, if I go back to my script again and I decide to say that actually I want it to be green, Control-Shift-B to build, back here, hit play, and now it's green. So you can see that turnaround time is so fast now. Which is really cool. And also hitting play does not take a year like it does in Unity. I have no idea what they're possibly doing to make it take that long. Like seriously, look at this. I have the simplest of Unity scenes here. There's one light, there's a camera, and there's one cube. And if I hit play, look at that. Let's do it again. What is it doing? But you can see I can play and stop so quickly here, which I think is really cool. And obviously, like, we're not doing anything too fancy at the moment, but we could be, and everything is kind of working. Is that all I wanted to show? I think it is everything that I wanted to show. What I did for the other entities, and that's why you have that random color thing. This isn't really related to physics, but you know, for this long thing, for this long kind of box here, I can add the script component that was called example.randomColor, I think. Yeah, and so now if I hit play, it's going to be a random color every time I play. Now the color doesn't get reset, you'll note. So that's one little thing that doesn't really happen correctly. And the reason it doesn't get reset is because at the moment that script is permanently modifying the actual mesh asset. So the mesh has a material and we're actually setting the uniform of the material to be that kind of random color. So because the script is kind of permanently modifying an asset and there's no copy of that asset happening, which is probably something that you want to happen during runtime, then it kind of persists like this. So the entity itself is being completely redone, but the entity still has a reference to a particular asset, and that change is more or less permanent. Anyway, that's it. If you have any questions about anything that I've done here, please ask them in the comment section below, because at this point, it's not going to be long, I think, before I actually start making more or less tutorials on how to do things in Hazel, as well as showing you guys how everything works and the general usability, I guess, of this engine. I also want to start doing some live streams just for everyone, not just for patrons, where I try and make games with this, because I would be really interested in seeing your feedback, seeing this kind of in action, as well as features and ideas that you might have, and I think it'll just be fun and a good time. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button below, and again, if you want to see something in action, or if you have any comments, or if you want to see how something works, then also let me know and I'll try and make some videos talking about that. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.